the Buache Map. In 1754, French geographer Philippe Buache presented a map to the Academy of Sciences in Paris that should have been impossible. His map showed Antarctica not as a single frozen landmass, but as two distinct subcontinents separated by a waterway. The problem was simple and profound. Antarctica wouldn't be officially discovered for another 65 years, and the ice-free topography beneath its mile-thick ice sheet wouldn't be confirmed until 1958, using modern seismic equipment and ice-penetrating radar. Buache claimed his map was based on older source maps, now lost to history. When researchers finally mapped the subglacial bedrock of Antarctica 2 centuries later, they found Buache had been correct. Beneath the ice lies an archipelago of islands and a channel dividing the continent exactly where his map indicated. The implications were staggering. Either Buache had access to maps created when Antarctica was ice-free, which geological evidence suggests was at least 6,000 years ago, or someone had surveyed the continent using technology comparable to 20th century seismic imaging. Academic institutions responded with dismissive silence, attributing the accuracy to remarkable coincidence. Buache's original source maps were never found, and inquiries into their provenance were quietly discouraged. His map was relegated to the footnotes of cartographic history, mentioned only as a curious anomaly. The question that was never answered remains: who mapped Antarctica without ice, and why has every trace of that civilization's existence been erased from the historical record? The waterway Buache drew with such precision now lies buried under ice, thick enough to entomb entire mountain ranges, silent testimony to knowledge that predates everything we've been taught about human history. The Haji Ahmed Map. In 1559, a Turkish admiral named Haji Ahmed created a world map that contained geographical information that wouldn't be officially discovered for another 200 years. His depiction of the western coast of the Americas showed features that would have required extensive surveying expeditions. But what made historians uneasy was his rendering of the Bering Strait and the Alaskan coastline. The strait connecting Asia and North America wasn't officially charted until Vitus Bering's expedition in 1728, yet Ahmed's map showed it with remarkable accuracy nearly 2 centuries earlier. Even more disturbing was his depiction of what appears to be a land bridge in the region, matching geological evidence of the Beringia land bridge that existed during the last ice age, over 10,000 years ago. Ahmed claimed, like many cartographers of his era, that he had copied his map from much older charts housed in the Library of Constantinople before its collections were dispersed and destroyed. Modern analysis of his work reveals longitude calculations that would have required chronometers not invented until the 18th century. The precision of his Pacific coastlines suggests aerial observation or a level of maritime exploration that contradicts every accepted timeline of discovery. When researchers pointed out these impossibilities, academic journals refused publication, citing the lack of supporting evidence. Ahmed's map was quietly archived, mentioned only in obscure cartographic studies that carefully avoided addressing its most problematic features. No investigation was ever launched into the source materials he claimed to have used. The libraries of Constantinople burned, and with them, any proof that pre-Columbian civilizations had achieved global navigation. What remains is a map that shows too much, knows too much, and has been systematically ignored for over 4 centuries, because acknowledging its accuracy would require rewriting the entire history of human exploration and technological development. The Glareanus Map. In 1510, Swiss scholar Heinrich Glareanus published a world map that contained South American coastal details that shouldn't have existed in European knowledge. Christopher Columbus had made his first voyage only 18 years earlier, and official Spanish expeditions were still mapping the eastern shores of the new continent. Yet Glareanus depicted portions of the western coast of South America, the Pacific side, with surprising accuracy. The Spanish wouldn't officially reach the Pacific coast of South America until Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama in 1513, 3 years after Glareanus published his map. The mathematical precision of the coastlines and the positioning of geographical features suggested direct surveying, not speculation or artistic interpretation. Glareanus never explained his sources, stating only that he had consulted ancient texts and charts available in European monasteries. When challenged by contemporaries about the origins of his geographical knowledge, he became evasive, and soon after, his cartographic work ceased entirely. Surviving records show that church officials visited him multiple times in the years following his map's publication. His later writings made no mention of cartography, focusing instead on music theory and theology. The original printing plates for his world map disappeared from the monastery where they were housed, and subsequent editions of his work omitted the most accurate geographical details. Modern researchers who have compared his coastlines to satellite imagery find correlation rates that exceed chance by statistically impossible margins. Academic conferences addressing pre-Columbian cartography routinely exclude discussion of Glareanus, maintaining that his accuracies are coincidental or the result of lost contemporary exploration that somehow left no other trace. His map suggests that knowledge of the entire American continent existed in European hands before the official age of exploration began, and that this knowledge was derived from source materials that predate Columbus by centuries, possibly millennia. The silence surrounding his work isn't accidental. It's systematic preservation of a historical narrative that cannot accommodate evidence of advanced pre-Columbian geographical knowledge. The King Jaime World Chart. In 1325, cartographers working under the patronage of King Jaime II of Aragon produced a world chart that displayed the coastline of Africa with a level of detail that Portuguese explorers wouldn't officially achieve for another century. The chart showed the bulge of West Africa, the Gulf of Guinea, and coastal features down to the southern tip of the continent, with geometric precision that required systematic surveying and mathematical calculation. Portuguese expeditions under Prince Henry the Navigator wouldn't begin their careful charting of the African coast until 1415, 90 years after this chart appeared. The precision wasn't limited to shape. The chart included latitude markers and proportional scaling that matched modern measurements within margins of error that suggest the use of instruments not officially invented until the 16th century. Contemporary records show the chart was copied from older sources held in the Royal Archives of Aragon, sources that were subsequently lost in a fire that destroyed portions of the palace library in 1348. Scholars who examined the chart before the source materials were destroyed noted references to Phoenician and Carthaginian origin materials, suggesting the knowledge dated back over 2,000 years. When Portuguese navigators later encountered African coastal landmarks, they reportedly carried copies of charts that predated their own expeditions, charts they were forbidden from discussing publicly. Royal decrees from the Portuguese crown imposed strict penalties on any navigator who revealed the existence of pre-exploration maps, citing protection of trade routes and national security. The King Jaime chart was never widely circulated, remaining in private royal collections until it surfaced briefly in the 18th century before disappearing again into institutional archives. Modern analysis using computer modeling and satellite comparison confirms that whoever created the original source materials had completed a comprehensive survey of the entire African continent, a feat that requires either centuries of cumulative effort by advanced maritime civilizations or surveying technology that we're only told was developed in the modern era. The chart's existence proves that the official narrative of African exploration is false, that knowledge of the continent's geography was deliberately suppressed, and that European powers possessed ancient maps they systematically concealed to maintain their claims of discovery. The Idrisi map. In 1154, the Arab geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi completed a world map for King Roger II of Sicily that contained geographical knowledge that shouldn't have existed in the 12th century. His map showed the source of the Nile, the accurate shape of the African Great Lakes, the river systems of Central Asia, and the configuration of the Indian subcontinent with precision that European explorers wouldn't achieve for another 700 years. Idrisi claimed he had compiled his map from the accounts of travelers and from ancient manuscripts preserved in the libraries of Cordoba and Baghdad. His depiction of the interior of Africa included details about mountain ranges, river tributaries and lake systems that remained unknown to European geography until the expeditions of the 19th century. The accuracy extended beyond Africa. His rendering of the Scandinavian peninsula, the coastlines of the Baltic Sea, and the river systems of Russia demonstrated knowledge of regions that had no official contact with the Arab world. When his map was presented to the king, it was engraved on a massive silver planisphere, a celestial and terrestrial map weighing over 400 pounds. Shortly after King Roger's death, the silver planisphere disappeared during political upheaval in Sicily. The map survived only through copies, and even these were systematically removed from circulation by both Islamic and Christian authorities. Scholars who studied Idrisi's sources reported that he had access to Ptolemaic materials that were more accurate than any Ptolemaic maps known to exist, suggesting his sources predated Ptolemy himself or represented corrected versions from an advanced geographical tradition. Libraries that housed these source materials were destroyed during the Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258, and the Reconquista of Spain, which saw the burning of Cordoba's irreplaceable manuscript collections. Modern comparisons between Idrisi's map and satellite imagery reveal that his continental outlines, river placements, and proportional scaling match reality far more closely than any European map produced before the 18th century. The knowledge he possessed was global, systematic, and mathematically sophisticated, suggesting an organized international effort to survey the entire known world. The destruction of his sources and the suppression of his map represent one of history's greatest losses, the erasure of a complete geographical understanding that took centuries to rebuild and even then, only partially. The Dulcert portolan chart. In 1339, Genoese cartographer Angelino Dulcert produced a portolan chart of the Mediterranean and Black Seas that demonstrated a level of precision that modern surveyors find difficult to explain. Portolan charts were navigational maps used by medieval sailors, but Dulcert's version contained geometric accuracies that suggested the use of trigonometric calculation and instruments for measuring angles and distances that weren't officially developed until centuries later. Computer analysis of his chart, conducted by researchers at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in 1996, found that his coastal outlines matched satellite-derived coordinates with an average error of less than half a degree. This level of precision is considered impossible without aerial surveying or a comprehensive network of ground-based measurement stations using sophisticated equipment. Dulcert's chart included no written explanation of his methods, no tables of calculation, no description of instruments. He simply presented it as a navigational tool, one among many portolan charts of the era, yet his stands apart for its mathematical perfection. When researchers attempted to publish their findings about the chart's accuracy, they encountered resistance from academic reviewers, who argued that medieval sailors must have achieved this precision through cumulative trial and error over generations. This explanation fails when applied to Dulcert's chart specifically, because it appeared suddenly in 1339, with no evolutionary predecessors showing progressive improvement. Earlier portolan charts were significantly less accurate, and later charts regressed in precision, suggesting Dulcert had access to source materials or knowledge that was lost shortly after. Records from Genoa indicate that Dulcert's workshop was ransacked in 1342, and his collection of charts and instruments was seized by authorities whose identity remains unknown. He produced no further cartographic work and died in obscurity. The mathematical techniques required to create his chart wouldn't be formalized in European cartography until the development of triangulation surveying in the 16th century, and wouldn't achieve his level of precision until the invention of the podolites and chronometers in the 18th century. The Dulcert chart proves that advanced surveying knowledge existed in the 14th century, was suppressed, and has never been adequately explained by historians who continue to attribute its accuracy to fortunate guesswork rather than confront the implications of its existence. The Reinel chart. In 1504, Portuguese cartographer Pedro Reinel created a nautical chart that showed portions of the North American coastline with disturbing accuracy, 8 years before official records claim any Portuguese expedition reached the New World. His chart depicted Newfoundland, sections of the Labrador coast, and what appears to be the entrance to the Hudson Bay with geographical details that required direct surveying. The Portuguese crown maintained strict secrecy regarding their navigational discoveries, enforcing a policy of cartographic censorship that made unauthorized possession of accurate maps a capital offense. Reinel worked under royal contract, and his charts were considered state secrets. Yet his 1504 map circulated briefly among European maritime powers before being recalled and suppressed. Analysis of the chart shows it contains longitude measurements accurate to within 1 degree, a feat that required chronometers not officially invented until 1735, over 200 years later. The Portuguese were known to possess a policy of deliberately falsifying maps released to the public while maintaining accurate secret charts for their own navigators, but Reinel's chart suggests their secret knowledge was far more extensive than historians acknowledge. Records from the Portuguese Torre do Tombo archives, which housed the kingdom's cartographic secrets, show that entire collections of maps were destroyed by royal order in 1537, shortly after Spain and Portugal signed treaties dividing the New World. Surviving inventories mention charts based on Norse sources and references to pre-Columbian Portuguese expeditions to the Grand Banks fisheries, but the physical evidence was systematically eliminated. Reinel's chart resurfaced in the 1800s in a German private collection, but attempts by researchers to study it were blocked by the Portuguese government, which claimed historical ownership and demanded its return. It was returned and immediately placed in restricted archives where access requires government clearance. The existence of Reinel's chart proves that European knowledge of the Americas predated Columbus, that this knowledge was systematically concealed to support territorial claims and colonial narratives, and that sophisticated navigational technology existed centuries before the official historical timeline acknowledges. What we've been taught about the Age of Discovery is a carefully constructed fiction, designed to obscure the reality that global navigation and mapping were achieved long before the 15th century, by civilizations whose records were deliberately destroyed. The Andrea Benincasa Map. In 1476, Venetian cartographer Andrea Benincasa produced a world map that contained latitude and longitude grids, with mathematical precision that shouldn't have been possible. Accurate longitude measurement requires precise timekeeping, and the chronometers necessary for this wouldn't be developed until John Harrison's marine chronometer in 1761. Nearly 300 years later. Yet Benincasa's map shows longitudinal spacing and proportional relationships between continents that match modern calculations within narrow margins of error. His map also depicted the Atlantic Islands, the western coast of Africa, and portions of the Indian Ocean with geometric accuracy that suggests a single coordinated surveying effort rather than accumulated knowledge from multiple sources. Contemporary records indicate Benincasa had access to the private map collections of Venice's Council of Ten, the city's intelligence and security apparatus, which maintained repositories of confiscated charts from around the Mediterranean world. These collections included materials seized from Byzantine libraries after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, just 23 years before Benincasa's map appeared. Venetian archives contain references to maps of great antiquity bearing Greek and Phoenician annotations, but these source materials have never been found. Shortly after completing his world map, Benincasa's workshop was destroyed in a fire that authorities attributed to an accident, though witnesses reported armed men entering the building shortly before flames appeared. Benincasa survived, but produced no further cartographic work, spending his remaining years as a minor clerk in the Venetian bureaucracy. His world map was purchased by a private collector and disappeared from public view for over 300 years. When it resurfaced in the 1870s, cartographic historians noted its sophistication but attributed it to Benincasa's skill rather than examining the impossibility of his techniques. Modern photogrammetric analysis reveals that his map uses a projection system that accounts for the Earth's spherical curvature in ways that weren't mathematically formalized until the 16th century. The precision of his coordinate system suggests he was copying from source materials that were themselves based on a global surveying network using standardized measurement protocols. The destruction of his workshop, the disappearance of his sources, and the centuries-long suppression of his map follow a pattern repeated throughout cartographic history. When maps reveal too much, they vanish and those who created them are silenced. The Ptolemy world map anomalies. In the 2nd century, Greco-Roman geographer Claudius Ptolemy compiled a world atlas that contained over 8,000 geographical coordinates for cities, mountains, rivers, and coastlines across Europe, Africa, and Asia. His work was based on earlier sources, some dating back centuries before his time, and when his coordinates are converted to modern latitude and longitude, researchers have found something extraordinary. Many of his measurements match contemporary satellite data with accuracy that seems impossible for ancient civilization. Ptolemy's coordinates for the Mediterranean region show error margins of less than 1 degree for hundreds of locations, suggesting a surveying network of remarkable sophistication. His measurements for the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean coastline, and the river systems of Asia demonstrate knowledge that official history claims didn't exist until European exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries. The most disturbing anomaly appears in his description of Southeast Asia and the lands beyond the Ganges, where his proportional relationships and directional bearings match actual geography far more closely than they should. Ptolemy himself admitted his work was a compilation of older sources, explicitly crediting the lost library of Alexandria and the work of earlier geographers whose names have been forgotten. When the Library of Alexandria was destroyed in a series of fires and purges between the 3rd and 7th centuries, whatever source materials Ptolemy used were lost forever. Medieval copies of his work were altered, degraded, and Christianized, with monks adding biblical geography and removing references to places and measurements that contradicted church doctrine. By the time Ptolemy's geography was rediscovered in Europe in the 15th century, it had been heavily modified, and scholars had to work backward to reconstruct his original coordinates. What they found was astonishing. Beneath the medieval corruptions lay a systematic global surveying effort that predated anything in the accepted historical record. Institutions that studied Ptolemy's original measurements were discouraged from publishing comparative analyses that highlighted the anomalies. Academic papers that suggested his sources represented lost advanced civilizations were rejected from major journals. The coordinates that matched modern data too closely were attributed to copying errors or later interpolations rather than confronting the possibility that ancient surveyors had achieved global geographical knowledge using methods we don't understand. Ptolemy's work is treated as primitive when in fact it preserves fragments of something far more advanced, deliberately obscured by those who control what history we're allowed to know. The Mercator Arctic Map. In 1569, Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator published a map of the Arctic that showed features no explorer had ever reported. At the center of the map, he depicted the North Pole as an open sea surrounded by a massive magnetic mountain, with 4 channels of water dividing the Arctic into 4 symmetrical landmasses. Mercator claimed he based this depiction on an ancient account titled Inventio Fortunata, a 14th-century travel narrative written by a Franciscan friar who allegedly journeyed to the Arctic. The original manuscript of Inventio Fortunata has never been found, and most historians dismiss it as medieval fantasy. Yet Mercator, one of the most respected cartographers of his time, treated it as reliable geographical intelligence. What makes his Arctic map deeply unsettling is that certain features he depicted, dismissed for centuries as fabrication, have proven accurate. His placement of landmasses and channels in the Canadian Arctic archipelago matches actual geography with precision that random guessing cannot explain. Modern magnetic surveys have revealed significant anomalies in the Arctic region, intense magnetic disturbances that affect navigation and that ancient mariners would have interpreted as a magnetic mountain. Mercator's 4 channels correspond roughly to actual waterways through the Arctic that wouldn't be fully charted until the 19th and 20th centuries. He also depicted Antarctic coastline features on other maps that wouldn't be discovered for 250 years. When researchers questioned where Mercator obtained his Arctic knowledge, they found references in his letters to ancient charts he had studied, charts he described as being of great antiquity and mathematical sophistication. These source maps disappeared after his death, and his family's attempts to preserve his collection were thwarted by authorities who confiscated materials deemed sensitive. The concept of an ice-free Arctic with navigable channels was strategically important, and governments suppressed any maps that suggested such routes existed or had existed in the past. Mercator's Arctic map was marginalized, his sources dismissed, and the Inventio Fortunata declared a hoax without any serious scholarly investigation. What remains is a map that shows too much based on a source that has been erased, depicting an Arctic geography that we're told was unknown yet rendered with accuracy that defies the official timeline. The pattern is unmistakable. When maps reveal knowledge that threatens the narrative of human progress and discovery, they are suppressed, their creators discredited, and their sources destroyed, leaving only fragments of a truth too dangerous to acknowledge.